What I want to do is go over some of the skeptical questions that people have about Noah and about the ark and about the flood.
That sounds like a good idea.
Let's deal with some of these skeptical questions. How did he fit all the animals on the ark? And we've heard all sorts of crazy numbers.
Yes, that's one reason that the ark doesn't work. Answers in Genesis' latest video is entitled Skeptics Do Not Want You to Watch This Video About the Ark. The thumbnail claims, You've been lied to about the ark. When I first saw that, I thought, great, another video about how most of the pictures are wrong about the shape. But no, I took a look at the first 3 minutes so far, and Tim Chafee does cover other things. I'm a skeptic, and I have no problem with you seeing this video. We'll even look at it together. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. A shout out to Rosemary Fulton, who joined as my newest channel member. Thank you, Rosemary. There are a lot of jump cuts in this Answers in Genesis video. I won't cover all of it, but I won't omit material within a segment, so any jump cuts that you see are in the original AIG video. Let's take a look.
Crazy numbers. I get emails saying, how did he fit all 6 million? How did he fit all 8 million species? How did he fit 11 million species? I've heard 80 million species. It's like they're just pulling numbers out of a hat.
Part of the reason that you get so many different numbers on how many species could have been on the ark is the various ways that you could interpret the Bible as to which animals were supposed to be taken on the ark. As the Bible says in one place to take 2 of each kind, and in another to take 7 pairs of the clean animals and birds and 1 pair of each of the rest. There's also the question of which animals qualify for inclusion, as the description of kinds is too vague. So why do different skeptics come up with different numbers that you need to fit onto your ark? Because your holy book is unclear about which animals were supposed to be included.
One of the skeptics, he put this picture in his rebuttal, trying to make the ark look silly. Do you guys see anything that looks sort of fishy? I understand whales are not fish technically, but why would he have to bring the whales?
Because you claim that the book must be taken literally, and your holy book says that Noah took every animal that has the breath of life. Whales breathe air in their lungs. Without air, they die. Thus, they have the breath of life. So if you must take this book literally, then the whales had to be included on the ark. If your point is that you don't need to take this book literally, then we don't have to include the whales. But we also don't need to read any of the rest of the story literally either, like that there was a global flood. So which is it? The book is literally true and Noah had whales on the boat, or the book is not literally true. You can't have it both ways.
The last time I checked, there would have been a pretty big pond outside the ark during the flood. In fact, it was bigger than the oceans had ever been before. He wouldn't have to bring the sea creatures.
Would he not? The problems for the sea creatures start with the salinity levels. If there was in fact enough rain, the amount of fresh water added to the ocean would be enormous. Further, you claim that there was enough rain falling in 40 days to flood the entire Earth to 20 feet over the tallest mountain. I have no idea how to do the math on this one, but fortunately, I found where Andrew Seidel has done it for me. Using these numbers, the rain would have diluted the salinity of the ocean by a factor of 3, meaning that the ocean is now only 1/3 of its pre-flood salinity, not even counting the fact that all of the freshwater lakes and rivers are now also diluting the ocean's salinity. Can ocean creatures survive in an environment that is only 1/3 of its salinity? A few can, but certainly not all of them. Oh, and most of the freshwater fish would die also. An even bigger issue comes with all of the turbidity. These 2 slides are from an article from the Institute for Creation Research. They recognize that turbidity would have resulted in the death of most of the fish. They conclude, thus, a situation might be envisioned where freshwater and marine fishes could survive the deluge. So even they recognize that the survival of the fish and other marine life is problematic. But for reasons not given in the article, they are sure that some of the marine life would survive. Think that Tim will get to the heat problem. There's also a major heat problem.
Our ark is 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, 51 feet tall, for a total volume of 1.88 million cubic feet. We've subtracted 15% for the volume because of the curvature of the hull and everything. Now, how big is that? Well, this is what it looks like next to a football field. Okay, it's huge. So how many animals had to go on the ark? Well, here's from the journal Science. We argue the number of species on Earth today is 5 plus or minus 3 million, of which 1.5 million are named.
Wait, how many species are there on the planet today?
5 plus or minus 3 million.
5 plus or minus 3 million. Weren't you just a minute ago complaining that skeptics are imprecise on how many species of animals there would have to have been on the boat? Now you come along with an estimate and give yourself a margin of 60% error. If you need a 60% margin of error on your estimate, don't be complaining about other people not being able to give you an exact number.
They're including a million different species of insects. He probably did not need to bring insects. Maybe the more delicate ones like butterflies and moths and bees, but they don't match the description of the animal that had to go on board the ark.
They didn't. Insects are not every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind. If God told Noah to bring every creeping thing according to its kind, and ants, beetles, worms, spiders, mantises are most definitely things that creep on the ground, how are you, Tim, telling Noah that it's okay to disobey God and not take the creeping things? Tim says it's okay for Noah to sin and disobey God. I call blasphemy. AIG doesn't want to include the insects because they would take up far more space on the boat than AIG is willing to admit. Many insects are, in fact, very small, but not all of them. And when you add up that there are about 5.5 million species alive today, then add in all that went extinct, and it's estimated that over 90% of all animals are now extinct, and AIG insists that there were no fossils before the flood and that all original animals that ever were all alive at the time of the flood. That would put over 60 million species of insects on the planet at the time of the flood. How many kinds is that, Tim?
We're dealing with kinds, not species. What's the difference? Well, if you think of the classification system that we have, so you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, and then family, genus, species. A lot of times people think, oh, you had to bring all these different species. No, the kind level is roughly equivalent to the family, so you go up a couple levels. It's not always equivalent there, but think about it this way. These are all different species of Tyrannosaur. Did he have to bring 2 of every one of those? Now, we think of just this guy here, the biggest and the baddest and the coolest, the T-Rex. But all of these are classified as different species of Tyrannosaur. What if what God brought to Noah was something like this, one of the smaller ones, fully grown? They don't take up as much space, do they? There's a lot of different ways to think about it. Here's one way we talk about it at the ark. Noah didn't have to bring all of these, all of the biggest ones that you could possibly find. He just needed 2 of these.
Problem with that is diversification. Again, AIG claims that before the flood there were no fossils. So all of the dinosaur species that we find in the fossil record had to have been alive at some point in the last 4,000 years. Now, if there is only a single pair of each kind, and those kinds then have to evolve into all the species for which we have fossil remains, and then they all go extinct, what time frame are we looking at all of this occurring in? Unfortunately, they don't give us an exact date, possibly because they know that it will put evolution at an impossible rate. First, according to this article, there are 15 major families of dinosaurs. So Noah would have to have at least 15 pairs of dinosaurs, or 30 dinosaurs. Cool. Then there are 700 different species of dinosaurs that we know of. So the 30 would then need to evolve to produce 700 distinct species. Next, AIG says that the flood triggered an ice age that began shortly after the flood and lasted 700 years, with glaciers covering 1/3 of the Earth's surface. They give no answer to the question of when the dinosaurs went extinct, just sometime after the flood, and I'm wondering how these species of dinosaurs, which cannot survive in tundra, are managing not just to survive, but to do so long enough to speciate into 700 distinct species before they all die out. And unfortunately, AIG doesn't accept most dating methods, so they don't have an estimate on the age of any of the dinosaur fossil finds.
He didn't need to bring any of these, any of the marine creatures. I know it seems silly to even have to say that, but because they include it so often, we had to make a point of it. But
You have to include it because most of the marine mammals would not survive off boat in a global flood, not to mention the fact that you would be disobeying God for not taking every kind of animal that has the breath of life. We haven't even covered the silt problem. AIG claims that mud basins were formed by dirt being swept from inland oceans during the flood. The massive silt created by this would have drowned most of the fish, as they can't breathe with dirt in their gills. Next, there's the heat problem. AIG claims that all of the movement of the tectonic plates from the Pangea to their current locations all happened in 1 year during the flood. Vice Rhino and Erica Gutzik-Gibbon have both made videos on the heat problem created by this claim, with lots of fun facts and calculations of just how much heat this would generate. Spoiler: enough to vaporize the planet several times over. So not only could none of the fish or insects survive off boat, as you claim, the boat would burn up, along with all of the life on the planet ceasing to exist. Links are in the description who want to see those videos for more details. Most interesting is how Creation Ministries International handles the problem, because they do recognize this as a serious problem. They took this question. I was debating someone about the Noah's Ark, and I was asked a question that I could not find an answer for on your website. An argument they had against the flood was that marine animals could not have survived the floodwaters because they say that the energy created by such an event would generate 3.65 octillion calories, which would increase the water temperature to 2,700 degrees Celsius. They received this information from the National Center of Science Education. I am just wondering if you have a good answer for that, or what are they getting wrong? The respondent obviously believes the Noah myth. The Creation Institute responded, whether that particular figure is right or not, there is most likely a severe heat budget issue for any purely natural explanation of what happened during the flood. As such, there is no simple scientific answer to this issue. Indeed, there may not be one. However, this need not be problematic. Why? First, because the biblical evidence creates considerable doubt on any notion that Noah's flood was a purely natural event. The uniqueness of the flood event and the fact that God was behind it shows that there is likely some supernatural activity embedded in the cause-effect narrative of the flood. But again, how do we model such an event solely with science? It seems unlikely. So CMI, at least, acknowledges that the ark is not possible, not without divine intervention, leaving one to wonder why, if God's intent was to just get rid of all the evil people, he didn't just Thanos them out of existence. Or better yet, just don't make them in the first place, as he knew that they would turn out this way if he did, and yet he chose to make them anyway.
But he did have to bring animals that are now considered extinct. If you think about the way you usually think about the ark, what animals are on there? Well, you got giraffe, you might have elephant, you got a lion, you got a monkey, you got a snake, and maybe a rhino or a hippo, right? Well, we didn't want to do it that way. We wanted to give a more realistic picture. We did about 50% that people would recognize and 50% that are now extinct since the time of the flood. So you'll see a more diverse picture than what you're used to seeing.
This is more problematic for them than it is helpful. Since 90% of all species of animal ever to have lived are now extinct, that just makes lots more animals that Noah had to cram into his little ark. And though it's big for a boat, it's still awfully small for a zoo, which houses far fewer animals. Even AIG's little 200 animal zoo is bigger than their ark. They create this problem for themselves because they claim that all fossils are the result of the flood. No species went extinct before the flood. So all fossils we have today must be of animals that were alive at the time of the flood. We have fossils of 250,000 species of animals. There are 5 to 10 million species alive today. So all of these had to be alive in Noah's day, as well as all of the extinct species that we know existed, but we don't have fossils of. My question is, if the earth is really all about man, God made all of this for man, why are all these animals going to die in the flood and get repopulated during an ice age that followed, only to go extinct again shortly after that? It seems like a waste of life for no purpose. And why all the speculation when the plan is just to wipe them all out?
Wipe them out. All of them.
By other means. This God either creates so he can enjoy watching things die, or he can't figure out how to accomplish his goals humanely.
How many of each kind had to go on board the ark? The Bible talks about 2 of every kind will come to you, but then he clarifies in the next chapter, just a couple sentences later, that there's going to be 7 or 7 pairs of all the clean animals and the flying creatures are going to come to him.
Please, tell me how 14 penguins managed to stay alive waddling through the desert to get to Mesopotamia, the most likely place for the start of the journey, as the Bible doesn't give us a starting point. And how did the koalas survive? They are very picky eaters. They will only eat eucalyptus, and only when it's still attached to the branch. If you pick the leaves, koalas will no longer recognize them as food. So even the joke that I've made about them carrying their food in backpacks wouldn't work. They also have a very slow metabolism because their diet is so fibrous. It takes a great deal of their energy for them to digest the leaves that they eat, so they sleep from 18 to 22 hours a day to digest. Now, as I was writing that, I was thinking, well, the solution is going to be that Noah didn't take any koalas, because to keep them alive, he would have to have a live eucalyptus tree on the ark for them to live in, or at least a tree to get branches from every time you want to feed the koala. So I wondered, what other animals are there in the same taxonomic family that would be easier to feed that Noah could take instead of the koalas? And then that animal could speciate into the koala after the flood. And there isn't any. The koala is in a family by itself. If Noah took 2 of each kind, and kind is family for the most part, the koala is in a kind by itself. He had to take 2 koalas. Please, tell me how Noah kept these picky eaters alive. Next, if the earth looked like this just before the flood, as AIG claims, how did the koala travel to the ark? They would have to have started the journey about a decade before the boat left just to travel the distance, only moving 2 to 6 hours a day, not to mention the fact that they would have starved as they would not have been able to find food along the way. I know, God magicked this too. Since God needs to do magic at each step of the process to make the process work, why not just magic the result and be done with it? The idea that an omniscient being would be so inept boggles the mind. Here's their answer: they don't know. Maybe they evolved to have this specialized diet after the flood.
Animals had to go on board the ark? Well, we had to count them all, and you can read the list on our website. In fact, you can look at the academic papers on these. How many amphibians? 194 kinds that are still around today, and that number, again, is probably greatly inflated. So 388 total because you multiply that by 2. Same thing with reptiles. Birds, you're multiplying most of those by 14 because most of them are flying creatures. There's some that are flightless. The mammals, some of those get multiplied by 14 because some of them are clean animals, like the cattle, the sheep, that kind of thing. And some of them are flying creatures, like the bats. In fact, we have over 300 bats on board the ark. So how many extinct animals? Well, there's the numbers. Does that add up to millions? The total number of animals is fewer than 6,800. The total number of kinds is fewer than 1,400. And again, those are overestimating the numbers. How could he possibly fit all the animals on the ark? Actually, they would fit in just right. We've run the numbers. We've had to go through and figure out how much room they take up, how much water they need, how much food they need. All of those different things have been put into our calculations, and when you put everything together, guess what? They fit just right. It's like Goldilocks. Doesn't it make sense that God would know how big the ark would need to be in order to hold the people and the animals and the food?
Please, show me a zoo where there are about 5,800 animals that could fit on this boat. Next, show me a zoo with 5,800 animals that is cared for by 8 zookeepers. At your park, you have nearly 200 animals. So by ARC standards, you should be fine with 1 zookeeper. In fact, you wouldn't even need a full-time one. Noah had one zookeeper for every 725 animals, so you should only need one to work about 3 hours a day. So, how many do you have? Here are several photos of the teams. I counted 44 people that you named in the photos that you posted. I asked on their Facebook page and got a response. They said that they have 40 to 50 zookeepers depending on the season. If one person can care for 725 animals, why do you need 40 to 50 people to care for a measly 200? I also found a site that reviews employers, where a person who says that they are a former AIG zookeeper was complaining about the treatment of the animals, saying if a zookeeper isn't there that day, some animals don't get fed. It seems to me that with 40 zookeepers, animals still going hungry with just 200 animals, 8 people could not possibly feed 5,800 animals daily and keep them all healthy. If all of them work 16 hours a day just feeding animals, they need to feed 45 animals every hour. Some animals don't need to eat every day, but in addition to feeding the animals, they also need to clean up after them. They also need to eat themselves once in a while, maybe bathe. Not to mention the fact that this is not smooth sailing. The boat is being thrown around. How do you keep running back and forth to the food stores, to the animals, while the boat is being tossed around by giant tsunamis that are flooding the inland areas? Maybe they're counting on all the passengers being so seasick that they don't eat, which leads to other problems, like dying of malnutrition. If just one of any of the animal species there dies, not only is that species gone, so is every species that is supposed to descend from it. I know, God can just magic this too.
So I mentioned dinosaurs a little bit ago, and people think, are you crazy? Dinosaurs on the Ark? I mean, come on. Really? Well, guys, that's not the Ark. That's a fairy tale. The Ark didn't look like that. And once you explain that the Ark was a lot bigger, they think, okay, I get it. The Ark was really big, but really? You think Argentinosaurus would go on there? I mean, they estimate they might have been between 60 and 80 tons? Well, fully grown. You don't have to take the biggest ones. You take the ones that got.
The problem with this claim is that most juveniles don't survive. Once an animal reaches adulthood, it is likely to live to whatever is old age for that species. But for most species, only a small percentage of the young make it to adulthood. I know, God used magic to determine which ones would survive and sent those. The next issue is growing juveniles actually need more food than older adults, so need to pack those crates of food even fuller. Not to mention the fact that most animals mature in a year, so even if you took juveniles, you have adults before you land. This article suggests that dinosaurs might not reach sexual maturity until later in life, possibly 18 for the T-Rex. And this article indicated that at least some dinosaurs would grow as fast as blue whales. So even if you didn't take full-size dinosaurs, you would likely have them at or near full size by the end of the journey. Better build an addition onto the ark while it's at sea.
How many people built the ark? Hebrews 11:7, by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear and prepared an ark for the saving of his household. Was he the only one swinging the hammer, do you think?
No one.
No one. Construction crews. A lot of times people think, no, there's no way he could do construction crews because these people didn't believe. There's no way they would work for him. Well, if there's a paycheck coming in, right, then many people might be willing to work even if they don't agree with the message.
Obviously, not if Noah held to the same employment standards as AIG. You have to sign not only a statement of faith to work there, you also have to agree to attend church outside of work hours weekly. If Noah had construction crews, he was more of an equal opportunity employer, unlike you.
Think about how great this would be for Noah. Noah could be like, you know what, I'll pay you as soon as it stops raining. No, I don't think he did that. Anyways, how many people built the ark? The answer is we just don't know.
Ha, ha, ha.
Wasn't it just a local flood? There are some Christians who have believed the idea that the earth is billions of years old, and they think those rock layers that we see out there are evidence of billions of years. And so they say, well, you can't have a worldwide flood because a worldwide flood would rip up all those layers and lay down new ones. You no longer have the evidence for billions of years. And so they say, well, it must have just been a local, a regional flood, or maybe it was just a worldwide flood that left no evidence. Yeah, you can laugh at that idea. What about this idea of a local flood? Does the Bible allow for that? Here's what we want to do with each of these questions. We want to go back to Scripture because that's where we want to start our thinking from.
Because if we want to know how to interpret what we find in geology, we need to first look at the Bible. Right. Because every geologist always begins by asking what the Bible says before analyzing anything.
We're going to start from God's Word. He's the one who knows everything. He's always been there, and He cannot lie.
Except when he does.
God could. I think the most important reason for us to believe that this is a worldwide flood, because at the end of it, God puts the rainbow in the sky and says, this is a reminder of my promise to you that I will never again, 3 times he says that, destroy the earth with a flood like this. If it was just a local flood, and we have local floods today, then that means every time you see a rainbow, God lied.
So that's what pride is really about, a month-long reminder that God lied. But seriously, if there was a global extinction of the human race, why was there no extinction of the civilizations around at the time, especially Egypt? The Egyptians kept building pyramids through this alleged event and never seemed to notice the flood.
Well, did he build the ark in the Middle East? Was there a Middle East? Just because it landed in that region after the flood doesn't mean that's where it started. The world was very different. It's not like they just went up and anchored and just stayed in the same spot the whole time. They would get carried along by the wind and the waves.
Okay, so maybe the koalas didn't have quite so far to travel because the Middle East might not be where the boat started from. I searched, but I could find nowhere where they give a start point for the journey. We're only 10 generations from Adam, though, so we can't be too far from Eden, which likely was in the Middle East, as the rivers described as being there, the Tigris and Euphrates, are in the Middle East. It would be odd for this Middle Eastern culture to have spread much further, but hey, God could magic that too.
So we don't know where they were when they built it. So ultimately, what is gopher wood? The answer is we just don't know.
Because repeating a bad joke makes it better, I guess.
How did Noah find all the animals? Skeptics love this one. Do you really think that Noah had to go to Australia and find the kangaroos and the koalas, and he got back and he's like, oh, guys, we forgot the wombats? Is that really the picture that the Bible gives us? No, remember we said we think that the world was very different. There was no Australia at the time. If we start from the Bible, we have the answer to this question. Genesis 6:20, of birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, 2 of every kind will come to you. He didn't have to go look for the animals. And yet how many times have we heard that?
Except you didn't answer the correct question. No one, to my knowledge, asks how Noah found the animals, because most of us skeptics have read your Bible, and we know that the animals were supposed to go to him. The problem, as I've already mentioned, is how did the animals even get there? The sloths and turtles would have had to have started the journey a decade in advance, as well as the koalas. Fun fact, sloths can starve to death with a full stomach because their metabolism is so slow. They don't have the energy to move much because their bodies, like the koalas, use most of it for digestion. A difficult journey indeed.
Happy old guy and a bunch of cute animals? Or is it about an extremely wicked world that had turned its back on God and was filled with violence and corruption throughout the whole world to the degree that God was grieved that he had made man and he was going to wipe man out, and yet he showed his grace and mercy to Noah and his family?
First, if this gave God so much grief, why did he make it in the first place? He's supposed to be omniscient. He's supposed to have known that this would happen. Next, he's supposed to be omnipotent. He's supposed to be able to do anything. If he wanted it differently, he could have just made it differently, so it wouldn't end up like this. So either this is exactly what he wanted because he enjoys drowning people and animals, or he originally wanted an evil world, but then changed his mind. Next, he's also an inept God, as the plan was a complete failure. In the same chapter where God says he'll never do that again, Noah is passed out drunk and naked in his tent. So the world is back to being evil almost immediately after all this death and destruction. What an utter failure of a God.
Several years ago, Bill Nye, guy that plays a science guy on TV, stood right here on the stage and did a debate with our CEO, with Ken Ham. And he said during the debate that his ancestors were shipbuilders in New England. And he said during that time when these large wooden ships were being constructed, he said the biggest one they were ever able to build was the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, and the problem was it was 430 feet long from tip to tip. So it's not quite as big as the Ark, but it's getting closer, right? And he said the problem was that it would keep springing holes, and it would twist and bend, and water kept coming in, and they'd have to keep trying to bail it out, and then it sank, and all 14 people on board were killed. And those things are true. But you know what? He left out a really, really important detail, and I want you to decide whether it was accidental or not. The Wyoming floated and carried thousands of tons of coal up and down the coast for over 14 years. Why do you think he didn't mention that at all?
In order to keep the Wyoming afloat, the ship had iron bracing and required steam-powered pumps to continually pump out the water that leaked in because of the buckling of the ship. Where is Noah's iron strapping on his ship's frame? The Bible is pretty specific about what to make the boat from, and iron isn't mentioned. Where are Noah's steam-powered pumps? Wyoming also ran into hurricane-force winds in 1915 and had to be towed to port. Why do you think Tim didn't mention that at all?
That's a possible misconception. A lot of people have heard that it never rained before the flood, and they get that from Genesis chapter 2, verse 5. Before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. The problem with that, this verse is describing the circumstances on day 6 before God makes man. Does that mean that we can extrapolate from that point in history to well over 1,000 years later and say it never rained on the earth? I don't really think that you can. I don't think that's the point of this verse. It's just setting up for what's about to happen. So that's why I say it's a possible misconception.
I heard that one when I was a believer, but Tim missed entirely what it was trying to explain. This myth was floated, pun intended, to explain why people lived so long. The theory was that a mist covered the earth so that no rain was needed, but also that this mist kept out some of the sun's UV rays, and that resulted in the unusually long lives that we see before the flood. It explained why man stopped living so long afterward. It's good to see that even AIG has let go of this myth, but I find it odd that Tim doesn't seem to know what the myth was supposed to explain.
Ask you this, if you were in the pre-flood world and there was a waterfall and you got the mist coming off of there and sunlight shines through it, what do you think you would see? I bet you see the colors of the spectrum. Now, could God have changed the laws of physics at that? I'm sure, but I don't think that he did. There doesn't seem to be a reason that he would have done that.
I find it laughable that you think that there's no reason for God to change the laws of physics to make rainbows possible after the flood when they weren't before, just because there was no reason to do so. But you think that God changed the laws of physics to create the geologic column in a single year, to make the Pangea race around the planet to reach its current location in a single year, changed radioactive decay rates to make it possible that all the decay before the flood matches with what we find today without a heat problem, changed the amount of water on the planet, and of course, the granddaddy of them all, the heat problem. God changed the laws of physics to solve the heat problem. If God is changing the laws of physics for so many things to accommodate the flood, why are you skeptical about God changing the laws of physics for rainbows? Maybe Tim needs to apply his skepticism about rainbows to a few other areas of his myth. I think he missed the boat on this one.
The Bible doesn't give us a whole lot of information about them. The Bible doesn't tell us really anything about her other than she was married to Noah, she survived the flood, and she had 3 sons. Do you think it's safe to assume that she was faithful? I think that's a pretty safe assumption.
Well, duh. The only men on the planet are her husband and her 3 sons. How would this even be a question? Or do you mean faithful to God? Since the Bible doesn't tell us anything about her, not even her name, as Tim points out, in parts that I omitted, this is nothing but speculation. Granted, it would be hard to make this voyage if she wasn't on board with it, as she also has her 45 animals to feed every hour, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Good thing the Sabbath hadn't been instituted yet. So you edited down a long lecture into a bunch of jump-cut clips and meshed them into a lot of nonsense, all in one video, which boils down to: how did the animals get to the ark? Magic. How did they survive on the ark? Magic. How did they keep from getting vaporized by the heat? Magic. How did the fish survive the silt? Magic. How did the animals get to their current locations afterward? Magic. How did the boat keep from sinking? Magic. Why did God do all of this? Because he did a bad job with creation the first time and had to start over. But for whatever reason, he didn't want to start with a clean slate like another planet. I did omit some portions of the video, but not because I don't want my audience to see them. Rather, they're just boring. Yes, I can see why skeptics don't want to watch your video. It's a waste of time. Live your life.